The moment Letitia Talbot stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, a gunshot cracked through the afternoon air, and every soul on the main street dropped to their knees except her, because she had already survived too much to let a bullet frighten her now. She stood there on the packed red dirt, her carpetbag clutched to her chest, and her dark hair whipping loose from its pins in the dry Texas wind, watching a man in a battered brown duster chase a loose horse down the center of the street, shouting instructions to nobody in particular. The horse was enormous, a wild-eyed roan with a broken lead rope trailing behind it, and it was heading straight for the general store's hitching post with what appeared to be genuine malicious intent. The man in the duster caught the rope just before the horse collided with three women who were standing outside the millinery shop. He planted his boot heels into the dirt, leaned back with every pound of his weight, and brought the animal to a sliding halt that raised a cloud of orange dust so thick it made Letitia's eyes water from 20 yards away. The townspeople applauded. The man tipped his hat. Then he turned, and his eyes found hers across the settling cloud of dust, and he held her gaze just a beat longer than a stranger ought to. Letitia looked away first. She had not come to Dusty Creek to meet a man. She had come to take over her late uncle's boarding house, sell it for whatever the market would bear, and get herself enough money to start a dressmaking shop back in St. Louis before the end of the summer. She had a plan, and that plan did not include any sun-weathered cowboys with unruly dark hair and eyes the color of creek water. She gathered her bag and walked to the far end of the street where she had been told the Talbot boarding house sat at the junction of Main and River Road. What she found there made her stomach sink to somewhere near her boots. The front porch sagged on one corner. Two of the shutters hung at angles that defied geometry. The sign above the door, which should have read Talbot's Fine ROOMS and Board, had lost its T, its second A, and the entire word fine, so that it now read ALBOT's ROOMS and Board. The garden her uncle had supposedly kept had gone completely to seed, and a goat was eating what remained of the front gate. "You must be Miss Talbot." The voice came from behind her, and she turned to find an older woman with iron-gray hair and an apron that had seen better decades standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed over her chest. Her expression was not unkind, merely cautious, the way people in hard country learned to look at newcomers until they knew what kind of person they were dealing with. "I am," Letitia said. "And you are?" "Mabel Greer. I run the laundry across the way. I was the one who wrote your uncle's letters when his hands got too bad with the arthritis. He passed 2 months ago in February. I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Letitia said, meaning it, because she had been fond of Uncle Harold even if she had only met him twice. "Do you know what happened to the building?" Mabel pursed her lips. "Well, your uncle let things go toward the end. He was not well, Miss Talbot. And after he passed, a fellow by the name of Carter Doyle started making noise about buying the property. He owns the saloon and 2 other buildings on this street and has been wanting to expand. He sent some of his boys around to discourage any other interested parties." She paused delicately, "including anyone who might want to repair the place." Letitia turned back to look at the building with a new kind of attention. "Is that legal?" "Very little that Carter Doyle does is legal," Mabel said, "but he has a way of making the sheriff look in another direction. You be careful, Miss Talbot. The man does not like to be crossed." Letitia thanked her and went inside. She spent the next hour taking inventory of what she had inherited. 4 guest rooms in varying states of disrepair, a kitchen that functioned if you were generous with the definition of the word, a parlor that might have been lovely once and could perhaps be lovely again, and a cellar full of her uncle's preserves, which at least meant she would not starve while she figured out what to do. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of strong tea and a growing sense of despair when someone knocked at the front door. She opened it to find the man from the street. He was still wearing the brown duster, and up close she could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with an honest face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something more interesting than mere handsomeness. He held his hat in his hands, and there was a sincerity in his posture that did not look practiced. "Miss Talbot," he said, "my name is Nelson Stone. I have the cattle operation out past the North Creek, about 4 miles from town. I was a friend of your uncle's. He mentioned you were coming, and I wanted to offer my assistance if there is anything you need." Letitia studied him for a moment. "Did he mention what condition he was leaving this building in?" A small, apologetic smile crossed his face. "He mentioned it needed some work." "Some work," she repeated, and she stepped aside to let him see the parlor ceiling where a water stain the shape of the state of Louisiana spread across the plaster. "Would you call that some work?" Nelson Stone looked at the ceiling, then back at her. "I would call that a project," he said carefully, "but not an impossible one." She surprised herself by laughing, just briefly, just enough to crack the wall of exhaustion and anxiety she had been holding herself together with since St. Louis. "Please come in, Mr. Stone. I will put on more tea." He sat across from her at the kitchen table and drank tea that was probably too strong for most people's taste without complaint, and he told her what he knew about Dusty Creek and about her uncle's final months, and she told him about St. Louis and her plan to sell the boarding house and return. He listened with the kind of attention that was increasingly rare, she had noticed, in men who thought they already knew the answers. "Doyle will not let you sell easily," Nelson said when she described what Mabel had told her. "He has been wanting this corner property for years. If you try to engage a buyer from outside town, he will find ways to discourage them." "What kind of ways?" "Rumors about the well water, stories about the foundation. He burned down the feed store 2 years ago when old Pete Rasmussen would not sell to him, though nothing was ever proven." Nelson's jaw tightened slightly, just enough for her to notice the anger he was keeping carefully controlled. "He has run this town through fear for long enough. Is there no one to stop him? There is the sheriff, Sam Briggs. He is not a bad man, but he has a family, and Doyle has made it clear what happens to people who inconvenience him." Nelson looked out the kitchen window at the overgrown garden. "People have stopped fighting back." "And you?" Letitia asked. "Have you stopped?" He looked at her then, and there was something direct and unguarded in his expression. "No," he said quietly, "I have not." He left an hour later, but not before promising to return with a few of his ranch hands the following morning to look at the porch and the roof. Letitia stood in the doorway and watched him walk back toward the main street, his horse tied to what remained of her front fence, and she told herself firmly that she was simply grateful for practical assistance and nothing more. She did not sleep well that night. The boarding house settled and creaked around her in the dark, and at some point past midnight she heard something outside that sounded like footsteps on the porch, and she sat up with her heart hammering and her uncle's old shotgun in her hands, until the sound resolved itself into nothing more than the wind moving a piece of loose siding. But she lay awake after that, thinking about Carter Doyle, and she thought about her plan, which had seemed so straightforward in St. Louis, and looked considerably more complicated now that she was actually here, in a building that was half ruin, in a town that was quietly afraid of a man who did not like to be told no. Nelson arrived the next morning exactly when he said he would, with 2 ranch hands named Miguel and Orson, and enough lumber strapped to a wagon to make a genuine difference to the porch. He had clearly assessed the situation the night before, because he came with a list of what needed to be done and a practical order in which to do it, and he directed his men with the kind of easy authority that did not need to announce itself. Letitia made breakfast for all 4 of them, which used nearly her entire remaining stock of eggs and salt pork, and she noticed that Miguel and Orson treated Nelson with the kind of loyalty that was earned rather than required. "You did not have to do this," she told Nelson when his men had gone back to work on the porch, and she was washing dishes at the kitchen basin. "Your uncle was kind to me when I first came to this country," Nelson said, picking up a dish and drying it without being asked. I was 23 and I had lost my father and I had bought the North Creek land with money I barely had and nothing in the way of experience. Harold Talbot taught me how to fix fences and how to judge cattle and how to read weather. I owed him more than a morning's work. Letitia turned to look at him. Where did you come from originally? Ohio, he said, and then he smiled, because it was clearly not the answer people expected. My father was a farmer. I was not cut out for Ohio farming. Too flat, too familiar. I needed something that felt like the edge of the world. Do you feel it here, the edge? He considered this seriously, which she liked. He did not make quick answers to serious questions. Some days, he said, some days it just feels like hard work and dry ground. She laughed again, and again it surprised her. Over the following week, the boarding house began to look like something a human being might voluntarily stay in. Nelson and his men came when they could, which was most mornings before the heat of the day became serious, and Letitia worked alongside them, learning quickly which tasks she could accomplish alone and which required more hands. She repainted the parlor, a warm cream color she found behind a loose board in the cellar, leftover from some previous renovation, and she repaired 2 of the guest rooms' windows with glass she ordered from the hardware store and paid for from the small amount of cash she had brought from St. Louis. She had enough money to last perhaps another month before she would need income, and the boarding house was not yet ready to take guests. On a Wednesday afternoon, 12 days after her arrival, Carter Doyle came to call. She knew who he was before he said his name. He was the kind of man who dressed expensively in a way that made money look graceless, and he had the smile of a person who had learned early that smiling was a tool rather than an expression. He was perhaps 50, with thick gray sideburns and small, very pale eyes that moved around the room cataloging value. "Miss Talbot," he said, standing in her newly painted parlor with his hat still on his head, which she noted was a deliberate rudeness. "I wanted to welcome you to Dusty Creek personally. It is a fine town. I have a great deal of investment in it." "So I have heard," she said pleasantly. "Would you like some tea, Mr. Doyle?" Something flickered behind his pale eyes at the pleasantness, because he had expected fear and she was not giving it to him. "I will come to the point. This property is in a location that is valuable to my business interests. I am prepared to make you a fair offer. You would leave with considerably more than this building is worth in its current condition." "That is very generous," Letitia said. "What is the figure?" He named an amount that was low. Not insultingly low, but low enough that she understood exactly what kind of negotiation this was intended to be. "I will think about it," she said. He was not accustomed to being told he would be considered rather than immediately answered. His smile remained in place, but it was working harder to stay there. "I would not take too long, Miss Talbot. Properties in this condition tend to deteriorate quickly. A woman alone, managing a building like this, it is a difficult situation." "I appreciate your concern," she said, walking to the door and opening it. "I will let you know my decision within the week." He left, and she closed the door, and she stood with her back against it, breathing slowly until the sound of his horse faded down the street. She went to Nelson's ranch that evening. She had not planned to go, but Mabel had told her the road was straightforward enough and she rode well, having learned on her father's farm in Kentucky before the family moved to the city. She borrowed a horse from the livery, and she found the stone ranch following the North Creek Road exactly as Nelson had described it, a collection of low buildings with good bones, the kind of place that had been built practically and was being improved steadily rather than built for show. Nelson was in the corral when she arrived, working a young horse through its paces, and he looked up with genuine surprise when he heard hoofbeats on his road. He came to the fence and she told him about Doyle's visit while he leaned on the top rail and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What is the building actually worth?" he asked. "I wrote to a man in San Antonio who assesses property. He has not replied yet, but I can read a balance sheet, Mr. Stone, and I know that corner property on a main street in a growing cattle town is worth considerably more than what Doyle offered." "It is," Nelson agreed. "Twice what he offered at minimum, possibly 3 times. He looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do?" She had been turning this question over since Doyle's pale eyes had moved around her parlor, counting what he intended to own. "I want to run the boarding house," she said, and the surprise of saying it aloud matched the surprise she had felt when the thought arrived fully formed that afternoon. "At least through the fall, long enough to understand what it is actually worth, and to have it in good enough condition that I am selling something real rather than something broken." Nelson nodded slowly. "That is a sound plan. It is also one that is going to make Carter Doyle very unhappy." "Yes," Nelson said, without any of the hesitation she might have expected. "It will." "I could use help," she said carefully, because she was not a woman who asked for things lightly. "Not charity, not favors. I mean a business arrangement. I have skills that are useful. I can manage a household, I can keep accounts, I can cook and I can sew and I can maintain a building. What I lack is knowledge of this particular town and its mechanics, and some measure of local standing, which you have." Nelson looked at her for a long, considering moment. "And what would I get from this arrangement?" "My uncle's south pasture," she said. "He left it to me in the deed along with the building, and it shares a fence line with your north field. I have no use for pasture. You do." Something shifted in his expression that was more than just business calculation. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he did not know he had been waiting for, but he kept his voice practical. "That is a fair trade, Miss Talbot." "Good," she said. "Then we have an agreement." She stayed for supper, which his cook, a taciturn man named Fletcher, produced without ceremony: roasted beef and corn bread and canned tomatoes that were somehow made delicious by salt and a cast iron pan. They ate on the porch as the sun went down over the Texas plains, and painted the sky in colors so violent and beautiful that Letitia had to set down her fork and simply look at it for a moment. "You do not see that in St. Louis," she said. "No," Nelson agreed beside her, watching her watch the sky. "You do not." She rode back to town in the blue dusk with a lightness in her chest that she attributed to having made a plan and stuck to it, and nothing else. She was careful with herself about nothing else for quite a while. The first guests came to the boarding house in mid-April, a traveling merchant and his wife from Dallas who were on their way further west and had heard, through some network Letitia could not identify, that the Talbot place was clean and the meals were good. They were pleasant people who paid on time and complimented the cream-colored parlor, and when they left, Letitia stood in their empty room for a moment feeling something she could only describe as pride. She wrote to her mother in St. Louis to say that she would not be coming back before summer's end. Her mother wrote back in a letter so densely packed with worry that it took Letitia 3 readings to extract all the individual concerns. Nelson came by most mornings on some pretext or another: a piece of fencing that needed looking at, or supplies he was collecting from the hardware store that happened to be right next to her building, or simply because he had news about the town that she ought to know. She found she looked forward to these morning appearances with a reliability that she eventually stopped pretending was purely practical. He was teaching her the town. Not only its geography but its character, which families had been there since the cattle drive started pushing through, which businesses were solid, and which were built on Doyle's money and therefore on foundations that could shift without warning. He knew which farmers were struggling and which ranchers were prospering and why, and he spoke of all of it without judgment, but with the kind of clear-eyed understanding that came from being genuinely curious about the people around you. She began to understand why her uncle had trusted him. One morning in late April she was at the market stall selecting vegetables when a woman her own age fell into step beside her and said, without preamble, "You are Letitia Talbot, and you are making Carter Doyle furious, which means I would like to be your friend." Letitia looked at her. She was a tall woman with copper-red hair and a direct gaze, wearing a sensible dress and a look of determined good humor. "And you are Clara Vane. My husband Thomas runs the newspaper." She picked up a bunch of carrots and examined them professionally. "He has been trying to write about Doyle's property schemes for 2 years. Nobody would talk to him, but if you were to give an account of your situation publicly on the record, it might make things rather interesting. Letitia considered this. Would it help? Sunlight is the best disinfectant, Clara said cheerfully. That is what Thomas always says. He is very idealistic. I try to keep him from being killed about it. Letitia bought the carrots and a promise to come to supper at the Vane house on Friday, and she left the market feeling as though Dusty Creek was, very slowly and despite its difficulties, becoming something like home. She gave her account to Thomas Vane that Friday, a careful, factual account of Doyle's offer and his implied threats, and the general climate of intimidation that Mabel and others had described. Thomas was a slight, serious young man with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers who listened with great intensity and took careful notes, and said thank you in a way that meant it. The article ran in the Dusty Creek Gazette the following Wednesday, and by Thursday morning the town had that particular quality of held breath that precedes some kind of change. Doyle's response was not immediate, which was in some ways worse than if it had been. Letitia found a dead bird on her front porch on Thursday morning. On Friday, someone smashed the newly repaired window in guest room number 2. On Saturday, she arrived at the market to find that 2 of the regular stall holders would not meet her eyes and would not sell to her. She went directly to Nelson's ranch. He saw her face when she rode up, and he came off the porch without a word and listened to what she told him, standing in the yard with his hat held in both hands and a very controlled expression on his face that she was learning to read as the kind of anger that was useful rather than destructive. "He is trying to frighten you," Nelson said. "It is working," she said honestly, because she was not the kind of person who pretended to be braver than she was. "I will not let it stop me. But I want you to know that I am frightened." He looked at her then with an expression that was entirely unguarded for one clear moment, and what she saw in it moved through her like a current. "You are the bravest person I have met in a long time," he said quietly, "and that includes men I have known for years." She felt heat rise in her face, and she looked away at the horizon, which was a safe place to look. "I need to know if you think this is still the right course, if the risk has become too large." "Letitia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it sounded careful in his mouth, deliberate. "The only way Doyle wins is if people keep looking away. You look directly at him. That matters. It matters to more people in this town than you know." She stayed for the afternoon, because she did not want to be alone in the boarding house, and because Nelson's ranch felt, inexplicably, like the safest place she could be. They sat on the porch, and she helped him with the accounts he was working through, because she had a head for numbers and he freely admitted he did not. And they talked about everything and nothing, about cattle prices and the politics of the railroad that was rumored to be coming through the county, and the books they had each read and what they thought of them. He had opinions about books, strong ones, which she had not expected, and they disagreed productively about a novel they had both read, and she enjoyed the disagreement enormously. The specific pleasure of arguing with someone who was genuinely engaging with what you said rather than simply waiting for you to stop talking. As the sun dropped, she stood to go, and he walked her to where her borrowed horse was tied, and he said, very carefully, as though the words had been considered for a while, "I would like to take you to dinner on Saturday evening. At the hotel restaurant, which is respectable and has nothing to do with Doyle's interests. I would like to take you to dinner because I want to, not because of any arrangement." She looked at him in the last of the daylight. He was watching her with quiet attention, the way he watched everything, ready to accept whatever the answer was without fuss. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." She rode back to town through the warm Texas evening with the feeling spreading through her chest as steady and warming as sunlight through glass. She told Clara Vane, and Clara made a sound that was half delight and half vindication, as though she had been expecting this particular development and was pleased to be proven right. "He is a good man," Clara said, pouring coffee with the ease of someone who had decided what she thought about things and did not intend to be talked out of it. He has been the most decent person in this county since I have known him, and I have never once seen him be cruel or small about anything. You could do considerably worse. We are going to dinner, Letitia said, as if the practical narrowness of the statement would contain the situation. It is one dinner. Clara looked at her over her coffee cup with the expression of a woman who had been married long enough to understand the difference between what people said and what was actually happening. She did not argue the point. The dinner was at the Dusty Creek Hotel's small restaurant, which had tablecloths that were genuinely white and candles, and a menu that attempted ambitious things with beef, and produced results that were more earnest than elegant but no less enjoyable for it. Nelson wore a clean coat that fit him well and had clearly been recently pressed, and he stood when she came into the room, which she found she was unreasonably moved by. They talked for 3 hours. She was not certain where the time went. They talked about his plans for the ranch, which were specific and well considered, a breeding program he had been working toward for 2 years, and a water diversion project he wanted to attempt on the South Field, which was now technically hers and therefore practically his under their arrangement. They talked about her plans, which were becoming less certain in their direction but more certain in their immediate shape. The boarding house was working, she was running it well, and she had had an idea about adding a small seamstress service for guests and for the town's women, which would bring in steady income through the slower travel months. He listened to her business idea with real attention and asked sensible questions about costs and timing, and she found herself elaborating because he made it interesting to think aloud. At some point, the restaurant emptied around them and the waiter, a young man named Percy who had clearly been hoping to go home for some time, began making increasingly visible gestures toward the door, and they both noticed simultaneously and looked at each other and laughed, the kind of laughter that happens between two people who are surprised to find themselves so comfortable with each other. He walked her back to the boarding house through the dark Main Street, and at her door he stopped and turned, and there was a moment that stretched like taffy between them, full of possibility. "I have to tell you something," Nelson said. "I told myself I would wait longer to say it, but I have been turning it over all evening, and I think waiting is just a kind of cowardice dressed up as patience." Letitia looked at him. Her heart had taken up a new, quick rhythm. "Tell me." "I have been glad every day since you came to this town," he said. "I was not expecting that. I was not looking for it. And I want you to know it, because you deserve to know what is true about how a person feels, and I am tired of being careful with it." The street was empty around them, the only sound the distant movement of the creek and the warm Texas night pressing close on all sides. Letitia looked at this man who had shown up with lumber and quiet steadiness and honest opinions about literature, and she understood with the clarity of something that has been true for a while before you see it, that she had been equally glad. "I am glad too," she said simply. He reached out and touched her hand where it held her door key. Just the briefest contact, the gentlest possible acknowledgement, and he stepped back and said good night. And she went inside and stood in her cream-colored parlor in the dark and felt the shape of the evening settle around her like something she had not known she was waiting for. In the weeks that followed, Nelson and Letitia developed a rhythm that was neither purely business nor purely courtship, but some honest combination of both, which suited them because they were both people who liked things to be real. He came in the mornings and helped with whatever was physically demanding, and she kept the accounts and managed the guests and developed the seamstress service, which proved almost immediately successful because she was genuinely skilled, and there was not another dressmaker within 30 miles. They rode out together on Sunday afternoons when the boarding house was quiet, following the creek north to where the land opened up and the sky became enormous, and they talked and were sometimes quiet together, which is a different and more important kind of comfort than talking. She was learning the ranch the way she was learning the town, through specifics, through the particulars of this water source and that fence line, and the way the creek moved in wet weather versus dry. He was teaching her about cattle with the patience he applied to everything, and she was better at it than either of them had expected, because she had a good memory and a genuine curiosity. Doyle had been quiet since the newspaper article, which Mabel told her was more worrying than the dead birds and the broken windows, because quiet from Doyle meant planning rather than impulsiveness. Sheriff Sam Briggs came to the boarding house one morning in May, and he stood in the parlor holding his hat and looking uncomfortable in the way of a man who knows he has not been doing everything he should. "Miss Talbot," he said, "I want you to know that I am aware of the harassment you have experienced, and I intend to make it clear to any interested parties that the law applies equally to everyone in this county." She looked at him steadily. "Has something changed, Sheriff?" He shifted his weight. He was a heavy-set man with an honest face that his position had put too many compromises on. "The county judge is coming through next month on circuit, Judge Harrigan. He and Doyle do not have a warm relationship, shall we say, and Doyle knows it. There is a degree of accountability coming that was not here before." "I see," Letitia said carefully. "And does this accountability extend to the feed store fire 2 years ago?" The sheriff looked at the floor. "Some investigations may be reopened," he said quietly. After he left, Letitia sat down and wrote a long letter to her mother describing the situation, not to frighten her, but because she had realized that her mother needed to know who her daughter was becoming, and that person was someone who was going to stay in Dusty Creek. She had not made this decision in a single moment. It had arrived gradually, the way convictions do, through accumulated evidence. The satisfaction of the boarding house running and improving, the seamstress clients who came back and brought their friends, Mabel Greer, who had become something like a second mother, Clara Vane, who was already a genuine friend. The town itself, which was rough and difficult but also real in a way that St. Louis's careful social arrangements had never been. And Nelson Stone, who was a fact about Dusty Creek that she could no more leave behind than she could leave behind the enormous sky or the warm red dust or the sound of the creek at night. She had not told him she was staying. She was not entirely sure how to begin. In early June, Carter Doyle made his move. He did not make it directly. He was too careful for directness when indirectness served as well. What happened was that a man appeared at the boarding house representing a land-holding company based in Houston, with paperwork suggesting that Letitia's uncle had signed an agreement giving the company first right of purchase on the property in the event of his death, an agreement that her uncle had apparently entered into 2 years before he died, when his mind was still clear but his hands were already failing. Letitia looked at the paperwork with the careful attention of someone who had spent considerable time keeping accounts and managing documents. Something about the signature did not sit right, the pen pressure inconsistent with the other samples of her uncle's handwriting she had found in the boarding house's files. But she was not a legal expert, and the man from Houston was professionally pleasant and had clearly done this before. She sent him away politely and went to find Nelson. He read the documents at his kitchen table with the focused concentration he brought to anything important, and then he sat back and said, "I need to send a telegram." "To whom?" "A lawyer in San Antonio I have used before. His name is David Reyes. He is very good, and he does not like fraud." 3 days later, David Reyes arrived in Dusty Creek on the afternoon stage, a compact, energetic man of perhaps 40 with sharp dark eyes and a briefcase that he handled like a weapon. He reviewed the documents Letitia provided in 2 hours, asked her a series of precise questions, and declared with the cheerful certainty of a man who enjoys being right about this kind of thing that the signature on the agreement was a forgery. "The ink composition is inconsistent," he said, holding the document up to the light. "Your uncle signed it with a different type of pen than his known samples. Additionally, the notary seal is from a county office that was closed at the date stated on the document. Whoever forged this was competent but not careful enough." The county judge arrived the following week, and David Reyes was ready for him. What happened in Judge Harrigan's temporary courtroom, which was the Dusty Creek Hotel's second parlor, was not dramatic in the way of gunfights or chases. It was the specific drama of evidence clearly presented, of a man's fraudulent schemes laid out in plain language before a judge who had seen enough of this kind of thing to understand exactly what he was looking at, and to be thoroughly annoyed by it. Carter Doyle was not present. He had, it emerged, left town 2 days before the judge's arrival, which was information that told everyone who needed to know something exactly what they needed to know about his confidence in his own position. The forged agreement was declared invalid. The feed store fire, reopened for investigation with 3 new witnesses who had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of judicial environment to speak, produced enough evidence to make Doyle's return to Dusty Creek extremely unlikely. The sheriff's previous reluctance transformed, in the presence of judicial attention, into a genuine willingness to enforce the law as written. The town's held breath released all at once, and what followed was something like jubilation, the particular relief of people who have been afraid for a long time and have now been given permission to stop. Mabel Greer hugged Letitia so firmly she lifted her slightly off the ground. Clara Vane cried, which she did with the same directness she brought to everything else. Thomas Vane produced a newspaper edition the next morning with a headline that was 3 times its usual size. Nelson found her standing on the boarding house porch late that evening, after the celebrations and the conversations and the long, exhausting relief of it all, watching the main street settle back into its normal quiet. He came and stood beside her on the porch, which was now solid beneath their feet, the rotten corner rebuilt in good lumber 3 months ago. "It is over," she said. "This part," he agreed. "The good parts are still coming." She turned to look at him in the porch's lamplight. He was watching her with the quiet intensity she had come to know as his truest expression, the one he wore when something mattered to him. "I am not going back to St. Louis," she said. The decision that had been building for weeks came out easily, without drama, the way true things tend to do. "I am going to stay and run the boarding house, and the seamstress work, and whatever else turns out to be needed." Nelson was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the way it was when he was making sure he said exactly what he meant. "I am glad to hear that," he said. "I have been hoping to hear that for a while." "Have you?" she said, not quite a question. "Letitia," he said, and again the care of her name in his mouth. "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it properly, because I mean it properly, and I do not want there to be any confusion about that." She waited. The Texas night was warm and the street was quiet, and a mockingbird was going through its repertoire somewhere in the darkness. "Would you consider courting me formally?" Nelson said. "With the intention, on my part, of asking you to marry me when we have known each other long enough for you to be certain." There it was, plain and honest and careful and exactly like him. She looked at this man who had come with lumber and stayed with steadiness, who had listened to her plans and helped make them real, who had told her she was brave at a moment when she needed to hear it most, who argued about books with genuine investment and could sit in comfortable silence for an hour without it being awkward, who loved this difficult, beautiful land and had made something real in it. "Yes," she said, "I would consider that." He reached out and took her hand, properly this time, and they stood on the porch of the boarding house she was keeping and looked out at the main street of the town she was choosing, and it felt like the beginning of something, the specific shape of which she was very glad she could not yet see. The summer that followed was the best of Letitia Talbot's life, and she was aware of it as it was happening, which was a rare and valuable thing. The boarding house filled steadily as word traveled along the cattle routes, and the stage roads that there was a clean, well-run establishment in Dusty Creek with good meals, and a dressmaking service of genuine quality. She hired 2 women to help her run it: Rosa, who was 18 and efficient and picked up household management with an aptitude that Letitia recognized immediately and encouraged, and Judith, a widow of 35 who had come to Dusty Creek following a rough year and turned out to be the finest cook in 3 counties. The rooms were all full by July. She had to turn people away, which was the particular difficulty of success. Nelson came every morning and most evenings, and the courtship was the kind that a person looks back on years later and understands was the foundation of everything, not dramatic but deeply pleasurable, built of 1,000 ordinary moments that were extraordinary in their accumulation. Sunday rides that sometimes stretched to sunset. Evenings on his porch or hers, going through accounts or simply talking. The first time he helped her hang new curtains in the parlor and they argued, with increasing amusement, about whether the left side was level for the better part of an hour. A thunderstorm in late June that drove them both onto the boarding house porch and kept them there for 3 hours while the rain came down in sheets, and they drank coffee and watched the street turn briefly to river. And he told her about his childhood in Ohio, and she told him about Kentucky, and they discovered they had both grown up reading the same books from the same circulating library catalogs. He held her hand when they walked. He was attentive in public in the way that communicated respect rather than possession, and she noticed this distinction and valued it. Clara Vane was mercilessly delighted by all of it, in the best possible way. "I told Thomas from the first week," she said to Letitia over coffee in August. "I said, those two are going to make each other very happy, and Thomas said, 'Clara, you cannot know that,' and I said, 'Thomas, I absolutely can.'" Thomas Vane, from across the table, smiled with the fond exasperation of a man who had learned that his wife was usually right about people. Nelson's ranch was prospering. The breeding program he had been working toward was producing results. His cattle were strong and his prices were good. And the south pasture that Letitia had transferred to him in their original arrangement was giving him exactly the additional grazing land he had needed. He had added 2 more men to his ranch hands, a young man from a local farming family named Will who was 18 and had a remarkable way with horses, and a Tejano cowboy named Andres, who was perhaps 20 and rode like he had been born in the saddle and probably had been. Andres and Rosa from the boarding house had been noticed by everyone in the vicinity to look at each other whenever they were in the same location, which in a town the size of Dusty Creek was with some frequency. Nelson said nothing about this directly, but she caught him smiling to himself at the general situation on more than one occasion. Letitia wrote to her mother again in August, a fuller letter this time, describing Nelson clearly and honestly, describing her life in Dusty Creek, describing the decision she had made to stay. Her mother's reply was cautiously warm, which was the warmest her mother tended to be with new information, and Letitia understood this was as close to a blessing as she was likely to get until her mother had seen the situation for herself. She invited her mother to come for Christmas, which was a decision that she made with a slight sense of the dramatic, but which she felt was right. In September, Nelson came to the boarding house on a Tuesday evening when she had finished with her accounts and was sitting in the parlor sewing, and he stood in the parlor doorway in a way she recognized as a man who has been deciding something for a while and has arrived at the place where he says it. "I think we have known each other long enough," he said. She set down her sewing. "Long enough for what?" He came into the parlor and sat across from her and looked at her with the clarity that she loved best about him, the refusal to hide important things in social decoration. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have wanted to ask since June. I have been patient because I said I would be, and because I meant it, that you should be certain. But I want you to know that I am certain, and I want to know if you are." Letitia looked at this man who had remade the landscape of what she had expected her life to be. She looked at him and thought of everything she knew about him now, not just the morning he arrived with lumber, but every morning after, every evening, every conversation about books and cattle and the price of window glass and the unreliability of Texas weather. She thought about what it felt like to be listened to by someone who was genuinely there. "I am certain," she said. He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a ring that was a simple band of gold with a small turquoise stone set in it, native blue-green against the gold, the color of the Texas sky on a clear morning. "This was my mother's," he said. "She left it to me when she died. She told me to give it to someone who deserved a whole life." Letitia felt something shift behind her eyes and she blinked it steady. "That is the nicest thing anyone has said to me." He slid the ring onto her finger and she looked at it there and felt the realness of it, the settled satisfaction of something that is right. "Yes," she said. "Nelson, yes." He smiled, and it was the best version of his smile, the one that reached all the way to his eyes, and she reached out and took his face in both hands and kissed him for the first time properly, and he kissed her back with the same steadiness he brought to everything, careful and present and entirely true. They were engaged in September of 1878, and she thought that was the right time for everything, the season after the heat, when the land had a little give in it again. They announced it at church on Sunday morning, and the congregation's response was the particular warmth of people who have watched something develop and are glad to see it reach its destination. Mabel Greer cried. Clara Vane looked at Thomas with an expression that very clearly communicated she had been right. Sheriff Sam Briggs shook Nelson's hand for a long time without saying very much, which was its own kind of eloquence. The month that followed was busy in the way of happy preparation. Letitia organized the wedding with the same methodical care she brought to managing the boarding house, but underneath the organization was a continuous current of joy that she was not trying to contain because there was no reason to contain it. She wrote to her mother with details and her mother wrote back with more warmth than before and confirmed that she would be coming for Christmas. Nelson and Letitia were married in November 1878 in Dusty Creek's small white church on a clear morning when the sky was the exact blue of the stone in her ring. She wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with small flowers embroidered at the sleeves and hem, the best work she had ever done, which she supposed was appropriate. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, open and glad and entirely present, not performing gladness but actually feeling it, which is different and so much better. They said their vows clearly and meant every word. Mabel Greer threw rice with such enthusiasm that she hit the minister, who took it in good stride. The wedding supper was in the boarding house, which had its best table settings out and flowers in every room that Judith had arranged with an artistry nobody had previously suspected she possessed, and the whole town came through at some point during the evening, because Dusty Creek was the kind of town where that was what you did, and Letitia found that she had stopped being an outsider without quite noticing it happen. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone and the lamps were low, she sat with Nelson on the front porch in the warm November night and leaned against his shoulder and looked at the main street of the town that was hers now, genuinely hers. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I came here to sell a building and leave," she said. "And instead I got a life." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "Your uncle knew what he was doing when he left it to you. Did he know about you?" Nelson was quiet for a moment. He used to mention, occasionally, that it was a shame the North Creek rancher did not have someone to manage his household properly. He said it was wasteful. There was warmth in his voice. He mentioned it several times. Letitia laughed and tucked herself more firmly against his side. "Uncle Harold," she said softly, "was a more interesting man than I gave him credit for." They moved into a practical arrangement that suited them both. Letitia kept the boarding house as her business, which she had built and intended to continue building, and she spent her mornings there while Nelson managed the ranch, and they came together in the evenings at the ranch house, which was bigger and had more prospect for expansion, and which Nelson had been quietly improving for months in anticipation. Her mother came for Christmas and stayed for 3 weeks, and by the end of the first week she had stopped looking at Dusty Creek with cautious metropolitan skepticism and started seeing what Letitia saw, a town with character and possibility, and people in it who were genuinely decent. By the end of the second week, she was having coffee with Mabel Greer every morning and discussing everything under the sun. By the end of the third week, she wept at the stage when she had to leave, which was not something Letitia had ever seen her mother do before. She squeezed Letitia's hands at the stage door and looked at her with the complicated expression of a mother who has had to revise her worries significantly. "You chose well," she said, meaning Nelson, meaning Dusty Creek, meaning all of it. "I know," Letitia said. "I actually know." January brought cold that surprised her with its sharpness, because she had thought Texas was warm, and it was warm in the summer, but the January nights were hard and clear, and the north wind had no sympathy for anyone who was not prepared. Nelson showed her how to keep the fires banked through the night, and which rooms of the ranch house held heat best, and how to check that the cattle water had not iced over, and she absorbed all of it with the appetite she brought to learning anything that was genuinely useful. The boarding house slowed in winter, as she had predicted and planned for, and she used the quieter weeks to work on the seamstress orders she had accumulated, which were substantial. The women of Dusty Creek and the surrounding farms had discovered that Letitia Stone, née Talbot, could make a dress that fit properly, which was a rarer skill than the world gave it credit for, and she had a list of orders extending into spring. Rosa had by now clearly become more than professionally aware of Andres, and vice versa, and they had been seen walking together on Sunday afternoons, and Letitia had made it a point to ensure Rosa knew she had nothing but goodwill toward that direction if Rosa chose it. And Rosa had gone pink to the ears and very serious, and said that she was grateful for Letitia's support. Nelson watched this development with the quiet satisfaction of a man who is very glad to see people happy. He had a genuine fondness for Andres, who was skilled and reliable and honorable, and Letitia suspected that he felt about Rosa something of the same protective affection he had described feeling toward Dusty Creek's people generally, the ones who were trying to make their lives honestly in a place that asked hard things of its inhabitants. By spring, Andres had spoken to Rosa formally about his intentions, and Rosa had accepted, and there was another occasion of Mabel throwing rice with excessive enthusiasm at a church that was becoming very familiar with joyful occasions. In March of 1879, Letitia discovered she was expecting a child. She told Nelson in the evening on the ranch house porch, which had become their habitual place for important things, and his response was to sit very still for a moment and then look at her with an expression so unguarded that it made her breath catch. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Reasonably," she said, smiling at the word because it was her own reasonable certainty that had brought her here in the first place. He reached out and took both her hands and held them. He did not say a great many things. He said, "I am going to take very good care of you both." And it was enough, more than enough, because she knew he meant it absolutely and would do it absolutely, because that was who he was. She told Mabel the next morning, and the look on Mabel's face was the look of someone receiving exactly the news she had been hoping for. Mabel made her sit down and drink warm milk, and gave her a collection of opinions about pregnancy that ranged from medically accurate to entirely folkloric, all delivered with equal confidence, and Letitia accepted them with affection. Clara Vane arrived that same afternoon, apparently operating on some independent information network, because Dusty Creek was the size of Dusty Creek, and said, "I heard, and I brought cake, and I am available to help in whatever capacity is useful." The pregnancy was, for the most part, uncomplicated. She continued running the boarding house through the spring and summer, reducing her hours as the pregnancy advanced, and Rosa proved so capable that the boarding house functioned beautifully with Letitia doing less, which was both reassuring and slightly humbling. Nelson was the kind of husband she had not been certain existed, not in the storybook sense of impossible perfection, but in the practical sense of a man who actually paid attention and actually showed up for the unglamorous parts. He brought her tea in the mornings when the early weeks were difficult, and he moved his ranch schedule around to accommodate the appointments with Doc Wheeler, the town's physician, who had the bedside manner of a competent person who had decided not to waste time on decoration, which Letitia respected. He talked to her about the baby with the same straightforward openness he talked about everything, curious about the experience she was having, asking questions that were genuine rather than polite, interested in the details. She told him she was grateful for him on a July evening when the heat was heavy, and she was sitting on the porch with her feet up, and he had brought her a glass of cold water from the well and sat down beside her, and the light was gold and low. "I do not take it for granted," she said, unprompted. "Any of it, this." He looked at her with the quiet entirety of his attention. "Neither do I," he said. "Not a single day." The baby was born in the early morning of October the 3rd, 1879, after a long night that was harder than anything Letitia had previously experienced, and that she got through because she was fundamentally not a person who gave up, and because Nelson stayed the whole night in exactly the way she needed him to without being asked, which was the kind of thing you learn about a person only when things are genuinely difficult. The child was a boy. They named him Harold for her uncle, and he was born strong and loud and already opinionated about things in the way that made Nelson laugh with genuine delight. Doc Wheeler declared them both healthy. Mabel arrived within the hour with food and opinions. Clara Vane arrived shortly after and held the baby with the practiced ease of someone who already had 2 children and handed him back without ceremony. Nelson held his son with the careful attention of a man who is aware that he is holding something irreplaceable, and he looked at Letitia over the baby's head with an expression she would remember her entire life. "Harold Stone," Nelson said quietly, as though introducing himself to the name. "Hello, Harold." The baby, to everyone's delight, seemed to consider this seriously for a moment and then went to sleep. Dusty Creek moved forward through the seasons with the particular energy of a town that has shaken off something that was holding it back. With Doyle gone, 2 new businesses opened on the main street, a proper doctor's office that allowed Doc Wheeler to stop working out of his house, and a small school that had been discussed for years, and was now a building with a teacher hired from Austin, a young woman named Miss Pierce who was formidably competent, and made it immediately clear that she expected the children of Dusty Creek to learn things. The railroad came through in 1880, not directly through the town but close enough that a branch line was added, and the cattle business expanded, and Nelson's breeding program was producing stock that commanded premium prices at the San Antonio market. He took on 2 more hands and built an additional barn, and the North Creek property that he had bought 10 years ago with money he barely had was looking like something solid that would last. Letitia's seamstress business had grown to the point where she was considering whether she wanted to hire someone else, because she could not manage both the boarding house at full capacity and the dress orders without stretching herself thin, and stretching herself thin was something she had decided, in the year since Harold was born, that she was going to be more careful about. Her time was not something she was willing to spend carelessly, because she understood now with full certainty what she wanted to spend it on. She made a list. The boarding house was profitable and running smoothly, and Rosa had become a manager in practice even if not yet formally in title. She promoted Rosa formally and gave her a corresponding increase in salary, and Rosa looked at the document of promotion with the expression of a person who has been hoping to be seen and is grateful to have been seen. The seamstress work she scaled to what she could manage comfortably, and she let the rest of the orders go to a woman in town who had recently arrived and was also a skilled dressmaker, a deliberate choice to help another woman start rather than to compete. It was the kind of decision that felt easy because she had enough, and she knew she had enough, which was its own form of wealth. Harold grew from infant to toddler with the confident curiosity of a child who is completely secure. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's Kentucky stubbornness, and he was, by the consensus of everyone who encountered him, a thoroughly agreeable person to be around. He was not a quiet child. He had opinions and expressed them, but he was fundamentally good-natured about the world in the way that happens when the world has been reliably good to you. Nelson taught him about horses before he could walk properly, holding him up against the fence of the corral to look at the animals with the child's complete, solemn attention. Letitia sat on the fence rail and watched this, and felt the full warm weight of the life she had made press up against her chest. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in the spring of 1878 with a carpetbag and a plan that turned out to be entirely the wrong plan and thereby accidentally led her to the right life. She thought about that woman with tenderness because she had been brave even when she was frightened, and because she had been willing to be wrong about what she needed, which is harder than being brave. In the summer of 1881, Letitia discovered she was expecting again, and told Nelson in the same way she had told him the first time, on the ranch house porch in the evening, and he had the same stillness and the same unguarded expression, and said the same essential thing, which was that he was going to take very good care of her, and he did. The second child was born in January of 1882, a girl this time, and they named her Clara, because Clara Vane had been a faithful and excellent friend and deserved the honor, and because the name suited the child, who arrived with the same directness that characterized her namesake. Clara Vane herself, at the naming ceremony, was so moved that she cried, and then immediately recovered and said something brisk and practical about the child's excellent lungs, which was her way of managing her own feelings, and everyone understood and loved her for it. Thomas Vane printed a notice in the Gazette that made reference to the naming, which Clara pretended to be embarrassed about and was clearly delighted by. Andres and Rosa had their first child that same year, a boy, and the two households moved through seasons of children and work, and the ordinary pleasures of a life that had chosen itself, which is the best way for a life to happen. The boarding house turned 5 years under Letitia's management in 1883, and she held a small supper for the people who had been part of its story, Mabel and Clara and Thomas and Rosa and Judith, who was still the finest cook in 3 counties, and had declined several offers to work elsewhere on the grounds that she was exactly where she wanted to be. Sheriff Sam Briggs came, a better man than he had been 5 years ago, because being allowed to do his job properly had turned out to be good for him. Doc Wheeler came and ate with the hearty appreciation of a man whose own cooking was not his strength. Nelson sat at the table of the boarding house's dining room and watched his wife manage this gathering, the way she moved through the room checking on people, the way she laughed, the way she looked up and found him looking at her, and let her expression do something quiet and private that was just for him. And he thought about the afternoon he had first seen her standing on the main street while the dust settled, not flinching, looking directly at everything. He had known then, or something in him had known, and he was grateful every day that the knowing had been right. After the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Letitia sat at the kitchen table of the boarding house with a cup of tea, which was where she had sat 5 years ago when everything was uncertain, and the ceiling had a stain the shape of Louisiana, and a man she did not know had shown up with lumber and changed the direction of her life. The stain was gone. The ceiling was good plaster, white and solid. The windows were all whole. The porch was steady under every foot that crossed it. She heard the front door and looked up, and Nelson came in and sat across from her exactly where he had sat that first afternoon, and she handed him a cup of tea without being asked, and he took it without thanking her, which was the language of people who are past the formality of gratitude and inside the deeper territory of taking care of each other. "What are you thinking?" he asked, which was what he always asked when she was quiet and looking at things. "About the stain," she said, looking up at the ceiling. "The Louisiana one. You remembered. You pointed it out the first afternoon," he said. "I could not have forgotten that if I tried." He looked at the ceiling with her. "What about it?" I was thinking about that afternoon, how frightened I was, not about Doyle specifically, but about all of it. Whether I had made a mistake, whether I had the wrong idea about myself, whether I was capable of what I thought I was capable of. And now, she looked at him, this man who was her home in the most fundamental sense, not a building but a person, a life she had grown inside of and that had grown inside of her. Now I know what I am capable of, she said. Which is quite a lot, as it turns out. He smiled. I always knew. You did not always know, she said. You had a reasonable confidence based on limited evidence. That is what knowing is, he said. At the beginning. She reached across the table and took his hand and held it, and outside the Texas night was warm and full of stars, and the creek was making its patient sound in the dark, and in the rooms above them their son and daughter were sleeping with the complete security of children who have never had reason to be afraid. Dusty Creek had grown around them, not enormously but steadily, the way healthy things grow, by adding to itself without losing what it was. The school had 2 teachers now. The newspaper had subscribers as far as Austin. The branch railroad had brought commerce, and the commerce had brought people, and the people had brought everything that people bring, difficulty and richness, and the specific texture of a place that is alive. Letitia had become something she had not planned to become, which was a fixture, not in the way that makes a person invisible, but in the way that makes them foundational. People came to her with problems, not because she had appointed herself anyone's authority, but because she was known to listen without judgment, and to help when she could and to be honest when she could not. Young women who were new to the county found their way to her boarding house and to her seamstress shop, and she helped them in whatever way was needed, because she had been new once and someone had helped her, and she believed in the obligation of that. Nelson continued to build the ranch with the patient ambition of a man who takes the long view about things. He and Letitia discussed the ranch's future on their Sunday rides, which they had continued through all the years in the way that habits formed in good times need to be honored. And he had ideas that stretch forward a decade, and she had ideas that stretch forward 2 decades, and their combined vision of what they were building was larger and more interesting than either of them could have generated alone. Harold was old enough by 1884 to accompany his father on ranch business, and he did so with the seriousness of a child who has decided to take something seriously, which was entirely his mother's face on his father's temperament, or perhaps the other way around. He had opinions about horses that were already more sophisticated than most adults Letitia knew, and he could read a weather sky with a reliability that even Fletcher, the ranch cook, conceded was impressive. Clara, the younger by 2 years, was a different personality entirely. Where Harold was steady and considered, Clara was fast and curious and constantly several steps ahead of whatever situation she was in. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's eyes, and she had inherited the stubbornness of both, doubled, which was a lot of stubbornness to be housed in a 6-year-old person, and Letitia handled it with the combination of firmness and respect for the child's actual intelligence that Clara seemed to require, and it worked reasonably well. On a particular Sunday afternoon in the fall of 1884, 6 years after Letitia Talbot had stepped off a stagecoach and refused to flinch, she and Nelson rode north along the creek in the afternoon light, while Harold was at the ranch with Fletcher, and Clara was with Mabel, who had become something so close to a grandmother to both children that the distinction was academic. They rode to the place where the creek turned and the land opened, and the sky became enormous in the way that had astonished her the first time she saw it, and had not stopped astonishing her in 6 years, because some things are not diminished by familiarity. They stopped there and let the horses graze and sat in the grass and looked at the land, which was theirs and which they were responsible for, and which was also simply itself, the land, indifferent and extraordinary. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," Letitia said, "if the boarding house had been in good condition when I arrived, if there had been no reason to need help?" Nelson considered this with the seriousness he gave to hypotheticals that were genuinely worth thinking about. You would have sold it in a month and gone back to St. Louis, he said. Yes. And I would have bought the South pasture through a different arrangement and continued doing exactly what I was doing. Yes. And we would never have met, he said, or met only briefly and not in a way that meant anything. That is a terrible thought, she said. It is, he agreed. Which is why I am very grateful for rotten porch boards. She laughed and leaned against him in the fall afternoon, and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the land they had made their lives on, the red earth and the dry grass, and the enormous sky going from blue to gold as the afternoon moved toward evening. I am going to tell you something, she said, that I have been meaning to say properly for a while and have not said properly. Tell me. She thought about how to put it, not because she was uncertain of the feeling, but because the feeling was large and she wanted the words to be adequate to it. You have made me the best version of myself, she said. Not by trying to, just by being who you are. I am more than I would have been without you, and I know that, and I want you to know that I know it. He was quiet for a moment, and she felt him breathe beside her. That is exactly what you have done for me, he said. Exactly the same thing. The sky went gold and then deep rose, and then the first stars appeared, and the creek made its patient sound, and the horses grazed, and they stayed there until the light was fully gone, and the Texas night had come down in its enormous, star-filled entirety over the land they had chosen, and the life they had built, and the love that had grown between them as steadily and surely as everything else they had planted in this hard and beautiful ground. They rode back to the ranch in starlight, side by side, and the house was lit and warm, and Harold had apparently fallen asleep in the kitchen and was being carried to bed by Fletcher with the dignity that only a sleeping 6-year-old can maintain. And Clara would be home from Mabel's in the morning. And the horses needed tending, and the accounts needed finishing, and there were always 100 things that constituted a life, and every single one of them was exactly where Letitia Stone wanted to be. She stood in the doorway of the ranch house and looked back at the dark plain and the creek reflecting stars and the vast particular beauty of this place she had come to by accident and stayed in by choice and loved with her whole heart. She had come to Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878 with a carpetbag and a plan that was entirely wrong, and she had gotten everything right instead. That was the best story she knew, and she was still inside it, and there was nowhere else in the world she would rather be.